So welcome back to Everything Marketplaces, where we talk with founders and leaders from some of today's top marketplaces. So this is episode 94, which is a very special group chat that we just had with the one and only Andrew Chen, who's a partner at Andreessen Horowitz and is also the author of The Cold Start Problem. So Andrew is one of, if not the top minds when it comes to both marketplaces and network effects. So this is a really incredible chat that we just had with Andrew, where we got to discuss the cold start problem in more detail, dove into some of the specific topics that he covered, such as atomic networks, and also had a really great Q&A for those on the chat. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I felt like it was almost a masterclass for both marketplaces and network effects. And so I know you're going to find a really great watch to the end. So Andrew, welcome to the group chat. And wow, this is a huge treat to have you join us here today. You're definitely one of the most requested group chat guests. And the cold start problem should be a required reading for every marketplace founder and leader. So I'm really excited to chat with you about the cold start problem in a little bit more detail and some of the topics that you covered in the book. And I'll also have a group Q&A here with some that are on the chat today. But before we do, though, I think it might be great if you can start off by sharing a little bit more on your background for those that don't know you as well, and then what led you to writing the cold start problem.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so I've been at Andreessen Horowitz now for 4 years, and one of my primary investment areas is marketplaces. And so we actually just did one a month ago. Actually, we just did two in the last month, which has been great. And then the firm also with Jeff Jordan, who was CEO of OpenTable, and before that was at eBay. We've done a whole bunch over the years. We've ended up investing in Airbnb and Instacart and Lyft, and many others. And then before my career in investing, I was at Uber during the hypergrowth years of the company, and so I talk about it in the book, of course. But this was a period where we were adding 3% of the world's population onto the platform each year. We were spending $300 million annually on the give-get program. Give $10, get $10, and another $1 billion on paid marketing. And then I was part of the executive group that oversaw the U.S. region, and so that was a $30 billion P&L. And we met weekly. It was myself and Travis and our head of finance and our head of operations, about a dozen other people to run the company. And then before that, I was a founder. So I actually raised money from Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz for my seed round, and Index Ventures and Ignition Partners for my Series A. And I was working on a bunch of Facebook apps back when that was a thing, and sold myself and the team to Uber as part of that. And so I've kind of straddled kind of social, and that's one of my investment areas, and then marketplaces is kind of being the other, which is why the various case studies in the book are kind of about that. And then personally, I am splitting my time between San Francisco and LA, and so I've probably been more in LA than SF recently. I happen to be in SF right now, in Lower Pack Heights, next to Japantown and Fillmore, if you guys know SF. The book was released in early December and selling super well. And you can come to the A16Z lobby whenever you want and pick up an extra copy. It's been a really fun thing to work on.
Yeah, that's quite the incredible background. Thanks for giving us a kind of quick rundown on that. And as we did mention here right before we started recording, certainly the cold start problem is kind of like the de facto kind of go-to handbook for us all in the world of marketplaces. So what led you to actually to write that?
Yeah, well, I think I've been writing for a long time on my blog, and which is just my name, andrewchen.com. And one of the big things after writing almost 1,000 essays was, I should probably organize some of it in a way that made sense. For a long time, one of the things I would do is take a piece of industry terminology, whether that's viral loops or cost of customer acquisition or something like that, and try to write the definitive piece about that piece of terminology. And so one of the things that comes up a lot in marketplace companies is, as many of you know, the chicken and egg problem, the the bootstrapping problem. It's known by various names, right? Or as I describe it, the cold start problem. and try to and really define that in the best way that I can. And so I started writing it 3 years ago and ended up interviewing just an amazing set of people, everyone from the CEOs and founders of Zoom and Slack and Tinder, and a lot of early Airbnb employees, a lot of early Lyft and Uber and Sidecar employees, folks from all over, and that was just incredibly fun to put something together that sort of talks about the entire field.
Yeah, certainly. I can certainly imagine that. Lots of great stories that you included in there. So, you did a really great job as far as, kind of laying out, well, first off, kind of like defining the cold start problem, and then, laying it out in the various stages. And one of the stages that you mentioned and kind of concepts you laid out in the book, as far as atomic networks, that's something that's come up quite a bit here since most of us are early stage marketplace founders and teams. And, I'd love to dive into that topic a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the main case study that I use that's in the book is how Tinder got started and off the ground. And the amazing thing about Tinder is, as a story, is that they actually got the product idea right pretty much from the beginning. And so when it was just Sean Rad and Jonathan Badeen and Ryan Ogle and like kind of this crew of about 4 or 5 people, the original app that they came up with was actually pretty much spot on. Like they had big photos, they had sign in with Facebook, they had the swiping, they had a lot of the right features pretty much off the bat. And this is something I think also for many of us in the marketplace side of things, building like a rideshare app from scratch, like, okay, great. That does have that, you have to innovate a lot for that. But if you look at what like StockX is doing, or you look at what Cameo is doing, or you look at what a lot of these modern marketplaces are doing, they actually the primary structure of them is actually not that different than products from 10 years ago. You need some concept of a listing, you need some search capability, you need some browse capability. And so because of that, you can actually nail the product side fairly easily. And if you sort of believe in the lean startup side of the world, if you just have the right features and you have the killer product, that should be it, right? Okay, well, but that's not what the Tinder folks figured out, right? What the Tinder folks figured out was they basically built this app. It was all the right features. And then what ended up happening that was problematic was they basically spent the first 6 months just inviting their friends to use the app. They would just text them and like try to get them on there. And you'd swipe through like 5 profiles, and then you'd immediately run out of people. And then that was it. And so they realized that, okay, it wasn't enough to just build the right features. They needed to get the right network into the app as well. And one of the big questions is, well, how many people do you need in an app like that in order for it to work? And this is where kind of a thought experiment would be very valuable, which is it's very clear that having 500 people all from the same city with the same context, who are all single, who are all looking for the same thing, that is much more effective than if you got 1 or 2 people from 10 different universities around the world, because because then it would be too fragmented. And so there's sort of this idea that, okay, yeah, you actually need density, you need clustering of a network in order for it to be valuable. And so because of that, what Tinder ended up doing was they ended up throwing a birthday party. They posted bouncers in front of the in front of the birthday party, and as a result, they were able to get 500 people at USC, one of the local universities in LA, to install the app. And then as a result, it just took over USC from there. And then they basically were able, they realized, okay, great. If they can build a network and that's what happens, they should be able to build a second network and a third network and like keep going from there. And so I think, for many of us that are thinking about this from a marketplace context, it's the reason why it's so hard when you build a marketplace to launch in 5 cities at once, right at the beginning, or to launch in 5 different product verticals at once at the beginning, and why you see so often that marketplace companies, in eBay's case, start out with, collectibles and sort of expand from there, or why you see, Uber start from kind of limos and black car services before, and to do it all in San Francisco and to show that I can work in San Francisco before expanding to other service lines and in other cities. And so I think that sort of nugget of like density as kind of a major advantage, and sort of, the idea is if you can build one, you can probably build many. I think that's an important point and realization that I think many of us in the marketplace industry have a better sense of, versus, interestingly enough, if you work at a bigger company, if you work at a Google or an Apple and you work in the digital world, you tend to not actually want to launch small and grow from there. You tend to want to kind of blast out to the whole world and have like a big PR push. And as a result, of course, you end up with the problem that a lot of those products end up not working because they can't actually sustain their network effects.
Yeah, that's a really great example, and certainly relatable to a lot of us here. So I did want to go a little bit deeper on that. So for early stage marketplaces, right? So like, how should we think about what that like initial kind of atomic network looks like, and then how would we think about measuring like what a strong kind of network looks like, or kind of like maybe initial kind of product market fit?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a conceptual thing and then there's an empirical thing. So on the conceptual side, I think you can reason and just think, well, for a product like Zoom, how many people do I need in order to make it useful, right? And you can kind of view it as like, well, it's pretty clear that you can have a conversation with just an individual, and that's very useful. And with the marketplace company, on the other hand, if something like Uber, where the drivers are fungible, the fact that one UberX driver from 20 minutes away versus an Uber driver that's 5 minutes away, if they're sort of interchangeable, that is a very different kind of marketplace than something like Airbnb, where you might have two different homes and you might think, oh, this one has a hot tub and this one doesn't. That's maybe what one consumer thinks. Another consumer might think, oh, well, this one's next to the park because I have a dog, I want that, versus another. So in those cases, the locations are non-fungible. And so because of that, you may have different things and you have to reason into how to figure it out. I think from an empirical standpoint, it's much harder, kind of like pre-launch, to figure out like, okay, well, how many, how much of a network do I need to build? But I think there's a very kind of easy rule of thumb, which is if you were to go back to the Tinder team and you were to say, okay, we only have like 100 people in this app, and we have this XYZ bounce rate. Now, if we add another 100 people, do we see that there's more engagement to be had? And I think you very quickly see, oh, well, there is. And then you could say, well, what happens if you add more and you launch in more cities? And then what you find is, oh, yes, there is. And eventually you get to a point where it doesn't matter, if, like, probably in San Francisco, I would guess that Tinder has something like 50,000 profiles. Like, I'm probably never going to swipe 50,000 profiles. So as a result, the difference between 50,000 profiles and 25,000 profiles, the retention curve between two cities that kind of have one versus the other stops mattering, because you start getting that diminishing return effect, which is kind of this S curve that I mentioned, in the cold start problem, which also exists, by the way, in Uber drivers eventually, because eventually you get 3-minute ETAs and you're like, okay, yeah, the difference between 10,000 drivers in San Francisco versus 11,000 is very different than, 1,000 drivers and 2,000 drivers, even though the delta is only 1,000 drivers in both cases. Doubling the number of drivers is just, provides a much better level of service. So I think you can do that. And then when you're big, one day when you're big and you have many marketplaces, many different things, what you can do is you can build a scatter plot ultimately, right? So ultimately, and we were able to do this at Uber, you can basically build an x-axis, which is the size of your network. That might be a city, that might be a company, that might be a team, however you define your network. And then you define a y-axis, which is like some kind of value, metric. And so that might be, sort of how you view, that might be retention rate or conversion rate or something like that. And what you'll see is, and then every dot that you put on this graph ends up being kind of one of your networks. So let's say you're a B2B company, let's say you're a Dropbox or something like that. What you might find is that there's an S curve, because when there are not that many users in your company, that are using, actually I'll use Slack, that might be cleaner. So if there's not a lot of people in your company using Slack, your retention will be good, but not like incredible. And then at some point it's going to really pick up because it's like, oh my God, everyone in my company is using Slack. It's our primary, sort of communication mechanism. But then there's going to be a little bit of an S curve, because eventually you'll get to a point where it's like, I just have too many notifications. I have like too many coworkers that are trying to ping me. If any of you have worked in a company with hundreds or thousands of people that all use Slack, that experience will be familiar. And you start using Slack more as one-to-one messaging or small group messaging, and you stop going to all the big channels. And so that becomes the other way to see it, because if you find that you plot all of your various networks and you're only seeing up and to the right, and you're not yet seeing the plateau, what that tells you is that most likely you can keep going, you can keep being more dense in your networks and kind of continue from there. So anyway, that's how I would comprehensively answer your question.
Yeah, no, that's a really great answer, and I know it's going to lead to some questions here when we get to the group Q&A. But I wanted to. This is a good kind of segue into assuming that as an early stage kind of marketplace that you do have that like kind of initial atomic network. One of the next kind of like things to think that a lot of us here think about is as far as potentially layering on new use cases, services, or expanding locations, right, as far as geographies. So how do you kind of think, when you're chatting with like early stage marketplaces, how do you kind of, help them think through this?
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're trying to do, right? I think that there is a world where you have decided that your core thing is working. And if your core business is working and you've been able to build an atomic network, then the question is, okay, well, how well can you build a second one or a third one or a fourth one? And what's certainly easier is to take the atomic network that you've built in one place, whether that's one campus or one city or one team, and to just build a second copy of it. And you're really just copying and pasting, right? I think that is itself hard enough, but that is relatively easy compared to layering on an additional service or product. Like that tends to be, you're taking on real, sort of market risk by doing that, because you just don't know if that's going to be possible or not. And so I think, the usually kind of from a staging standpoint, what I would say is the seed round is really for getting your initial product to market. Your Series A, where usually what we are finding is we're usually doing them between 3 to 5 million in gross revenue in GMV. And when we do the Series A around that, typically they're maybe only in one market. They might be in a market and a half or something like that. But we don't expect them to be in 3 markets or 5 markets or 10 markets or whatever. And they're raising something in the realm of kind of like $10 million plus or minus. What we find in the Series B, though, once we get into like kind of a growth stage, if it becomes kind of more of a stretch, it becomes like a $20 million raise, $25 million raise, then you're really expecting, okay, the copy and paste machine is really working, right? And not only do we see this company in multiple cities or multiple teams or multiple campuses or however way you want to cut it, but also they're able to replicate this very consistently. And so one of the things I often ask for is some kind of a like GMV on the y-axis, and then the x-axis is time. And then you have multiple lines, each one is its own city or each one is its own team. And what you want to see is that every single one of these new networks that's being up and running is working better and better than before, is one of the things you start looking for. And then so oftentimes to finish off your question, it really just depends on the timing of all these things. And I think I tend to be very realistic about what you can accomplish early. And so early on, I tend to not push for too many new products or too many new geographies, because as long as if the market is big enough, you should be able to take an individual vertical, whether that's again a city or campus or whatever, and you should be able to show that that individual atomic network is worth hopefully tens of millions of dollars because if you're copying and pasting a bunch of those, you're going to eventually run out. And you want to make sure that each atomic network is valuable enough on its own so that when you replicate it 300 times, you're able to get something where the GMV is in the billions or tens of billions.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So what, as far as on the note is copy and pasting and kind of the playbook and scaling in new markets. Are there any recent examples of maybe earlier stage marketplaces you've seen or worked with or maybe advise that have done this really well? And maybe sharing a little bit about what that playbook is like that they've used.
Yeah, definitely. Well, there's a couple of companies that we've invested in recently that I can talk about. One that I love and might and actually some of you guys may even be customers, is a company called Nash. And what it is it's let me just actually it's like basically it's usenash.com. So
I can put it in the chat right here.
Okay, yeah. Oh, there it goes. Okay, I found it. Right. Yeah, exactly. It's this one. And so what they do is they basically they've created a set of APIs and apps so that on one side of the network, it is couriers and like fleets. So these are kind of like delivery, folks, and like think of this as kind of the long tail of delivery providers that exist in every city. And so this is like bike messengers. This is trucks with refrigeration in them. This is all sorts of people. And then on the flip side, on the other side is basically everybody from florists and kind of small businesses and also apps, right? So basically, if you wanted to add delivery to your app, you could implement them in an API and integrate it into your app, and then that way you wouldn't have to recruit drivers yourself. So that's another really good one. And so for this, what I really enjoyed about it, the way that the founders talk about their business is it's both geographical and digital in its own way. Because if you think about it, the networks on the supply side, on the labor side, which is the delivery, ultimately you actually have to go city within a city and just call down and basically just use sales, right? I think one of the things that you find about working with the hard side of the market is you often ends up being very sales driven. And so you're just calling down all these providers, which is what the team's done. On the flip side, what you end up doing on the demand side is a lot of these are small businesses, a lot of these are apps, a lot of these are startups, and they exist not necessarily in a geography. Part of what they want to do is they want to build a new app that basically can deliver it anywhere. And so in that case, those networks are built on a sort of category by category basis, whether that's like healthcare and you're delivering COVID tests, or whether that's food and you're working with food delivery providers. There's kind of lots of different ways, but that's an example of a recent investment of ours that has approached it in a very interesting way.
Yeah, that's a great example. And when you mention being a sales led or sales driven, you got quite a few nods here in the group chat. So I think a lot of us here can relate to that.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I think we ended up talking about that at Uber all the time, where the operating team that would basically run a city was kind of a trio of people. It was the general manager who oversaw the entire region. Then there was a driver operations, which was basically a very sales-driven, very hands-on, very quantitative. And then there was a marketing manager who tended to be more on the demand side. And that person tended to be much more broadcast and demand and social media and performance marketing. And so I think that's one of the hardest things about marketplace companies is you ultimately have to master all the skills needed to be a successful consumer business and all the skills needed to be a successful B2B company. And then you overlay, fintech, and you also overlay international, and you overlay all the other things. It's one of the most complex business models, out there, which is part of the fun.
Certainly. So we're going to get into group questions here in a little bit, because otherwise I feel like you and I could just go on chatting for quite a bit. But like right before we do though, so I would love to learn, what are maybe like, 1 to 3 kind of like key takeaways or tips, from the cold start problem that you like to share with us as earlier stage, probably marketplace founders.
Yeah, I think the first thing is just like know where you are in from a stage standpoint, and don't fool yourself there. I think a lot of folks who don't have product market fit basically think, okay, yeah, I just need to raise and burn a lot of money, and that's the right way to do it. When in fact Uber started out very very early on extremely lean and only started to spend enormous amounts of money once they were kind of accelerating and going from there. So I think understanding where you are is important. Are you at the cold start problem, or are you at the tipping point stage, or are you working on saturation? Like, what are you working on? And that you have different strategies for different phases. I think that's one of the most important points that I make. The second thing I would say is there is a long playbook of different things that you can do. And so some people, they should build, they should do a come for the tools, stay for the network, kind of strategy as coined by my colleague Chris Dixon, or others maybe should be subsidizing all that growth. And I think the only way to figure out ultimately is you can't remove the art from all of this. Like there's just a long phase of experimentation that you end up going through, and that's just part and key to the whole thing. So I think that's important. And then the final thing I'll mention is that I think a lot of times what we're seeing in the market is that there's a lack of understanding around kind of the metrics guidelines and targets that you need to hit in order to show that you're an interesting company. And so for us, that's why we're always thinking about and looking at, I reference this in kind of the I think it's like 3/4 of the way through the book, kind of the triple, double framework, because ultimately there is a minimum growth rate that we need to see. And then similarly, we want to see retention rates, at least on one side of the network, of over 50% annually, and there's a good reason for that also based on benchmarks that we see it. So I know as a early when you're building something really early, it's hard to assess like how good is my product market fit. And so I think looking at some of those metrics and comparing are some of the key ways to do it.
Awesome. That's really helpful. Cool. We're gonna jump right into some of the questions. See quite a few hands raised, but hey, John, do you want to jump on?
Cool. Andrew, thanks for being here. My background's as a PM at Uber, LinkedIn, and then a startup called Curated. So been working in marketplaces for a while. I'm now a founder of a marketplace in the expertise economy space. So wanted to double click a little bit more on timing for expansion, and then also kind of what you see go wrong in expansion. I think it's easy to start to feel the pull from customers or supply side and start to think, this is exactly the time we need to go, but then kind of underestimate the team and the resources. So just curious if you could speak more to when it's absolutely time to start going and expand that network or launch new categories, and kind of what teams can do to prepare to actually expand successfully.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny enough, I would say that the most common reason why we end up seeing teams expand is as a proof point to investors, for better or worse, right? And I'll give the counterpoint to myself at the end of this, but I think what investors need to be able to see when they are valuing a company at several hundred million in valuation, so if you look at it from the investor lens, whatever price that they come in at, they basically are underwriting that easily there should be a 2 to 3x step up in valuation in the next round. So if they're coming in at 200 or 300 million in valuation, you're saying that potentially they're going to be a 600 to 900 million valuation company in 18 to 24 months. And you're kind of like, well, how do you do that, right? Like, so typically you're not going to do that purely by taking your core market and just growing it a bunch, because one of the things that you have a lot more control of is you actually have a lot more control of opening in more markets as compared to growing an individual market 3x. It's usually easier just to open more markets. And so as a result of that, investors really want to see it. And so one of the first conversations that I have with a startup as soon as we've done our investment, literally the first board meeting, is asking them, do you feel like you have a good sense for what you need to accomplish in the next 18 months to raise your next round? And hopefully the answer is yes. Hopefully others have been having that conversation with them along the way. And one of the first things that often ends up happening, especially once you are in the kind of 100 million plus type valuation range, is to show repeatability, to show that one flavor is I think lowest hanging fruit is just opening more markets. So that's more cities, more colleges, more teams, more et cetera. And then the second is, once you've kind of mined that, are there more services that you can offer, and showing a growth path there too. And so I think you ultimately need to be able to show both. But I think right around kind of the Series B, kind of the end of the Series A is kind of when you should be thinking about adding a lot more regions. And so what that means is that's typically kind of, think of that as, you're kind of in the $5 to $10 million GMV kind of range is when you should start thinking about it. You should be thinking about it when you've shown that you can, I think almost always, if you're successful in one home market, investors will kind of view it as like you kind of get that for free because you understand your market so well. A second market is often good, but you often pick a second market that's also easy. I think 3 is kind of the magic number where you can start to argue that it's repeatable. And so any 3 and above are kind of like, 3 or 3 plus markets is kind of when I start to think, okay, yeah, we can start to connect the dots and underwrite this to 5 markets or 10 markets.
Great question.
Thank you.
Hey, Rich, do you want to jump on?
Yeah. Hey, Andrew, how you doing? Former marketplace founder and now a fintech founder based upon my learnings on the supply side. I'm curious to know your thoughts around defensibility on marketplaces. You mentioned Nash, which is a delivery API, Webflow, no code, banking as a service solutions. When you're kind of evaluating a company to invest in, how do you think about defensibility using those types of tools?
Yeah, I think ultimately, from a defensibility standpoint, I think you ultimately have to ask the question, do you think that is the market going to be a winner take most type of market? It's rare, by the way, that you have truly a winner take all, because even in the cases where people talk about winner take all, as I address in the book, oftentimes you find these niches where where people pop up, and then it's hard to stamp out these niches. And so almost every marketplace has kind of niche competitors that emerge over time. And so I just think about it as winner take most. And so I think the question comes down to thinking about the thought experiment of each side of the market. So typically when I analyze a marketplace company for investment, I usually think about the demand side first, then the supply side. I think about, in each case, acquisition versus retention. And I think about imagining a small version of the network and a big version of the network and how you might choose differently depending on the thing. So in the Nash case, part of the reason why I got excited about it is if you are a company that delivers cakes, like super fancy cakes anywhere in the US, and you basically want to mail them to like a hub, and then you want to overnight them to a hub, and then you want to deliver it to somebody kind of last mile. And would you rather work with a large network or a small network, right? And I think the first thing you would say is like, yeah, you probably work with a large network, because if you work with a small network, the problem becomes there's a lot of different areas that you may not be able to deliver to. And then on the flip side, if you are a courier, individual courier, you might think, okay, do I want to work with a company that gives me a lot of business, or do I want to work with a company that gives me a little bit of business? And in that case, you might say, well, maybe you should just do both, right? In that case, you can sort of dual app and do that. And so that might indicate that, for example, the demand side of the business, the companies that integrate into Nash are probably stickier than the delivery side of the network. And so that sort of implies that, okay, one of the most important things for the company is probably to figure out on the labor side, how to make that as sticky as possible. Well, how do you do that? Maybe you build tooling, maybe you have loyalty programs, maybe you pre-buy a lot of the time, the hours from people ahead of time. You sign them into exclusive contracts. What do you do? So I think you need an answer there. But I think generally, the reason why network effects end up being so powerful and defensible is that building these networks ends up becoming, from scratch. Like people argue, like, well, Uber's network effect is not that strong. You're like, okay, cool. Try to build a rideshare company these days, right, from scratch. Like it's not going to happen. Like it would literally cost like tens of billions of dollars. And so I think the reality is that once you get one of these up and running, it cuts off the number of new entrants. And then the only people you're competing with are the people that you kind of started around the same time as you, plus or minus kind of 3 years. So that's generally how I've been thinking about it.
Thank you.
I feel like we're getting like a masterclass right now. So I love it. Awesome. Hey, Laura, did you want to jump on?
Hey, Andrew, how are you doing?
Good.
Awesome. So I'm in the space where SaaS-enabled labor marketplace. And my question to you is, as we go into our next round and think about our next valuation, how do you think about, I guess, quantifying and qualifying an engaged community that you're not necessarily monetizing from? So we've got like a multiple on SaaS and GMV, but any thoughts in terms of the supply side of the community and how you kind of talk to that?
Yeah. Well, I think the good news is that there has been a long history of companies where settlement. So there's kind of two flavors of this, right? So one is where the settlement of the actual transactions does not happen inside the marketplace, but you can kind of like estimate it. So like a good example in New York is a company called Good Dog, which is all about pet adoption. And it's basically like a lead gen business ultimately, because it's a multi-$1,000 purchase and it's sort of a long sales cycle. And so the reality is you maybe don't, settle on there, but they've attracted a tremendous amount of investment, because one of the things they can point to is they're able to point to the idea that the leads that they're sending are worth a certain amount. And it's sort of like one step before GMV. Is sort of like a qualified interest, like dollars amount. I have a company that we recently invested in that's called Stonks that does the same thing. It's basically like a demo day product. You can basically run demo days on it, but you can't settle on the platform right now. You can't invest in the company on the platform. But what it does is you can say, well, I want to invest 100K, and then it'll connect you off platform. And then they can count that, so that's one flavor of kind of like off-platform transactions. The other version as well is, I think one of the pieces of good news is that when you look at a product like Pinterest, for example, that's a product that has a lot of fundamental user engagement. They look and feel like a social network. It's sort of a monthly actives, kind of based, product. But at the same time, that it's at least mid-funnel in the purchase cycle. And so you can also just look at and talk about your product as if it's a social network, with the idea that if there's some embedded amount of commercial intent, then the monetization story ought to be easier as a result. And then frankly, Laura, basically the earlier the business is, the less you're focused on, the revenue piece of it. And so, because we often see, lead gen numbers, we often see take rates that are like way out of bounds of what it's going to end up. And so as an investor, you kind of have to close your eyes and imagine, where it's going to go over the next couple of years.
Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. We're going to try to squeeze in two quick questions if we can.
Okay, cool. I'll do a lightning round version.
Awesome. Hey, Jennifer, do you want to come on?
Thanks so much. Thanks for this, Andrew. It's been really good. So since reading Cold Start Problem, I've been obviously building more and thinking more in terms of atomic networks and the hard side. And what I found, I have a mental health and wellness marketplace, is that the creators and the providers sort of ended up buying from each other, and they were becoming like their own little ecosystem. My question is, how much would you suggest continuing to focus on the creators and the providers, considering they are buying each other's services, compared to starting to focus on the demand side of things in our marketing and so on?
Right. Well, I think what's definitely honestly easiest is if you can build one side of a network and then it just works on its own. And so in PayPal's case, right, like that was always sort of the quintessential kind of one-sided network, is it was just peer to peer. The buyers were the sellers. And so I think it might be very attractive to go through that. And it might be very, it might be that market ends up being larger than you think it is, or ends up at least being a really good initial market. So I'm not against, exploring that more deeply and seeing if you can add to the network over time before you then add the demand side into the equation. So I think it sounds intriguing, and I think probably one of the things that you're questioning is just, is it too small of a market to just focus on creators and vendors kind of interacting with each other? And I would say if they're retaining extremely well and they're selling high value services, that might be a great place to start, and then you can always expand from there. That's one of the beauties of the marketplace model, is that it lends itself towards expanding in terms of services.
Well, thanks so much. I'm going to come see you speak at Startup Grind next week.
Great.
Awesome. Sam, you want to jump on really quick?
Yeah. Super short question. Marketplace for offline media. So kind of the Airbnb problem. We've got billboards, we've got mass transit. You can rapid ice cream truck, sponsor pizza boxes. The challenge is like the perception of adverse selection. Everybody wants to be in Times Square. That's generally, one, not where they need to be, and two, that's usually sold out. So there's not a lot of value for them being in our marketplace. But if you want to reach like Elon Musk, where there's a billboard we know who drives past every month kind of thing. So the solving for the perception of adverse selection when the real value is in the long tail. Again, like Airbnb, everybody has a different definition of value. But imagine you had to rent like 40 Airbnbs from 20 different companies. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think adverse selection is definitely one of the most interesting problems that marketplace companies can potentially solve, right? I mean, I think in many ways you would say, aren't Airbnbs adversely selected compared to hotels? And the answer is they could be, except that Airbnb also added photos and they added reviews and they added enough functionality such that you would actually feel like you had a really, really great experience. And in a similar way, I think one of the other marketplace companies I've invested in many years ago is AngelList. And one of the issues with AngelList was that it was also adversely selected because many of the companies that were being brought onto the platform that won in funding were the ones that were having trouble raising funding, and as a result were adversely selected compared to the ones who didn't use AngelList. So how do you solve that? Well, AngelList ended up solving that by creating syndicates, private syndicates, by creating private platforms for funds to use. And so as a result, because of that privacy element, now companies sign up for AngelList, even without the intent of having a public fundraising kind of flow, which helps a lot. So I think the question for you would be in doing that, are there things that you can do to add a layer of functionality or value that maybe for a different buyer who doesn't want to be in Times Square, right? Maybe they're more of a performance marketer. Maybe they're more of a, somebody that is hyper-focused on certain regions, that you're able to provide a way that you can establish liquidity there. I think that would be one question that I would have. And then the second question I would have is, obviously, the more that you can, create define what performance means in a new way, whether that means it's a star rating system, but even better would be if there were a way that you could add, if you added a layer to manage all the 1-800 numbers, calls that were coming, from the thing, and in order to track that, and so then you could then give like a better ROI metric for some of the further flung billboards. Maybe that becomes interesting, but I think you have to do something to establish a different set of buyers and sellers in order to build something separately. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a world where it's like you're trying to sell Airbnb inventory to hotel shoppers, right? And if that's not what they're looking for, they're not going to want that. You're going to want people that are looking for a neighborhood experience, or they're looking for a more homey experience for a longer stay. And if you can segment out that market, then you're better off. And so in the book, I have a section about cherry picking, which is exactly about this, which is you need to cherry pick a niche that's probably already working, as opposed to thinking about it like you're trying to just disrupt the whole thing, starting at once.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for taking the time to, to get to that last question. I know we're actually over right now. So I appreciate it. Well, this is a really incredible chat. So I know we're all, looking forward to it here as, marketplace founders and leaders, and, huge fans of you and the cold start problem. And, last but not least, so time for kind of a quick plug. Where should we keep up with you?
Yeah, so I just so the big thing that I use for my big pieces is andrewchen.com, so you can sign up to the newsletter there. If there are questions that I didn't get to, if you want to hit me on Twitter, happy to. I'm back to back today, but I'll try and get to everyone's questions. If you want to just ask me a question on there, I can type in a tweet thread. So
amazing. We really appreciate it. Maybe I'll start like a thread on there where we can all just share our
nice
questions there. So
nice.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks again. So thanks everyone for joining today.
Yep. Thank you guys. See you later.